Sadly, when people think of Mr. Freeze, they think of Arnold Schwarzenegger's terrible puns from the Batman and Robin 1997 film, but I'm here to tell you that he's a really cool supervillain, and I'm going to talk about his really cool toys here on a Halloween special of Inside the Toy Room. So again, following our theme this October, looking at Supervillains, which is inspired by Variant Comics and Arias Quinones. Make sure you check out that channel because I love that channel, I've done for many years. So today we're going to take a look at Mr. Freeze. Now Mr. Freeze is my favourite Batman villain because he is really cool. You had to get an ice pun in that. I just had to. He's really good. He's a really good villain. Now, I'm going to quickly go over the comic book history and then get into the toys because that's what we're here to talk about inside the toy room. He first appeared in Batman 121 in February of 1959. Yeah, he's that old, but he was originally called Mr. Zero. And he didn't really have much of a plot behind him. He appeared again as Mr. Freeze some years later, and he was just kind of this, I think in the 60s show, I think that's where the idea of the accent came from, because he had a Middle European accent. But again, it was just a weird nondescript character, didn't really have any backstory, and that was until the Batman animated series came along, you know, looked at this character and thought, right, we can make something really cool here, let's give him this amazing backstory. And that would be that he was originally working at Wayne Tech in the cryogenics department to try and find a cure for his then terminally ill wife, and he fell into, you know, this accident that transformed him into Mr. Freeze. He requires his suit to keep him below sub-zero temperatures so that he doesn't die, and his entire mission is to make sure that he can find a cure for his wife. So all of his evil deeds that make him run into Batman, you know, he's always got a motive behind them, and I really like that about any villain. Now, they did reimagine the backstory of Mr. Freeze and make it a bit more creepy in around 2007, maybe later, and the reimagination of the story is pretty grim. So he still worked at Wayne Tech in the cryogenics department, but Nora, who is his wife, was actually a test subject that is frozen in time when she's a 12-year-old girl, and he creepingly falls in love with her because at a very young age believes this woman to be his wife even though she isn't, and it gives it a really sinister tone, which, to be fair, the character probably needed, because when you just look at it on face value of the I'm just trying to save my wife, you're like, Batman, leave him alone. You're Bruce Wayne, you've got all the money in the world, give him the money to look after his wife, stop being a dick. So yeah, I guess he needed a sinister twist on the character. Again, that story isn't really looked at that often. In Gotham, the TV series, I think is the best telling of Mr. Freeze so far. His look was incredible, his backstory was heartbreaking, but he also wasn't doing any of his evil deeds to justify, you know, he couldn't bring his wife back, she's gone. He was just doing it because he was just lashing out and he was angry, and now he'd also been, you know, victim of this cryogenic, and yeah, and his look, and that gets me into the action figures. Now, before I go into the action figure history, I just want to say that the Gotham Arkham City look of him as well, but I'm going to go with the Gotham one here, is just so cool, and I've seen some action figures from Gotham of this Mr. Freeze, and I'm definitely going to track that down to Inside the Toy Room. And the same can be said about the Arkham games as well. I've always thought that they did such a good job of capturing a more sinister, almost, you know, you're terrified of this guy, and his look, again, just they got the suit down but they still made him intimidating without him looking like an astronaut. It just looks really cool. Now, of course, everyone remembers the 1997 Mr. Freeze portrayed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, I'm gonna give it a moment's defense before we jump into the bad script. His initial look, it's pretty cool. It's pretty intimidating. The first time he walks down them steps and he screams, "Mercy!" That's intimidating. Like, he looked awesome. And that end scene when Poison Ivy is picking at the flower and she loves me not, and then he goes, "Not!" and he just glows up and he steps forward in this big mechanical suit, and he's, you know, I mean, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger under there, for crying out loud, it's the Terminator, but I think it's really intimidating. It's just that the rest of the film just made him, you know, at one point he's puffing on a cigar in some slippers that look like massive polar bears, and yeah, that's just hokey. Now, As far as action figures go, there hasn't been that great deal amount of Mr. Freeze action figures up until the animated series came around. There was one in 1989 when Toy Biz was producing, I think it was just called like DC Superheroes or DC Supervillains, and they did various ones, and they also happened to do a Mr. Freeze. It's a hodgepodge of all different colours. It's really random. I guess at that point Mr. Freeze didn't have a definitive look because that was prior to the animated series. So it's a really odd looking action figure. It's probably one that I'll want to get at some point inside the toy room, but I'm not like scrambling to try and get this, if I'm completely honest. Now fast forward to Batman the Animated Series, where they give this character this great reimagining and incredible backstory, and even better, this amazing new intimidating look, and you have this. You can see on the back it shoots his freeze gun and the box art. I love the look of this Mr. Freeze, so much so, to stick to the theme of Halloween, that I once went as this Mr. Freeze to a Halloween party. I said to a Halloween party, we hosted it at this house. I was Mr. Freeze and Gemma went as Nora, who was, her skin was cracking and freezing. It was really cool. Oh, for God's sake, I'm gonna say, when I talk about Mr. Freeze, I cannot say the word cool. But I love the look of this. There's one figure that I do want to get, and it's like a collectible Warner Brothers one of a statue of this Mr. Freeze. There's also, I've got some of the animated series busts right behind me here, and there's a Mr. Freeze one of that I do want to get my hands on, just because I think the animated series look of Mr. Freeze is, I mean, I love everything about the animated series, but it was the first one that really made me go, oh, he's a cool. And it was the first one that made me go, oh, he's an awesome villain. He's really, really good. And I just, you know, I attached to the villains for some reason. I ended up making a career of it in pro wrestling, so hey. The Batman series changed direction to become the New Adventures of Batman and Robin, and when they did so, they changed the look of Mr. Freeze, and he ended up in this all black suit, which I have featured right here, and this is of course from the DC Collectibles range. So the new Batman Adventures. They changed his look. I wasn't a big fan of this. What was the big turnaround was when his head could detach and he was just like a little spider crawling along. That was just weird. I did miss the old look of Mr. Freeze, and I was very happy that when they did the Sub-Zero film that they went back to that classic animated series look of Mr. Freeze, because yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of this change. Understand it still looks creepy. His face looks more like a skull, which I guess it would if he's freezing, right? He's got no blood going through him, so yeah. Then of course came along Batman and Robin 1997. Now I've already spoke about how I thought the look of him in that was really intimidating. We got some really amazing toys from the Batman and Robin 97. I've got two of the Mr. Freezes right here. I've got the deluxe one here. I've got three of them because I've got the Cold Night in Gotham City where he's fighting Batman, and then obviously I've got the Ice Blast Mr. Freeze, and we've got the deluxe one just right there. We was always going to get a lot of toys from that film, and we did, but again, some of them are okay, some of them are just, they just happen to resemble Mr. Freeze really. I'm not really a big fan of all of them. And then after that, we had different interpretations of Mr. Freeze in various animated series. Of course the comic books, but the only toys that got produced was based from different cartoons that was coming out and how Mr. Freeze would look in those cartoons. And if I'm completely honest, at that point I wasn't really watching the cartoons anymore. I was just reading the comics, and I've moved away from that, and maybe that's why I don't have any nostalgia purpose to go out and collect those figures. It wasn't until I played the Arkham games and I looked at how they'd done Mr. Freeze there, and I was like, okay, that's really good. And as I mentioned at the start of this episode, they're action figures that I'm probably going to try and get my hands on at some point to feature inside this toy room, because Freeze, like as I say, I go on about him all the time, but I think he's such an amazing villain, and so I want to get as many of the action figures as I can. There's an amazing comic book that's just called Mr. Freeze. It's like a very short one, and it gives you some of the backstory, a bit more detail of his childhood and things like that. So while I'm on about Mr. Freeze, yeah, hunt that down if you're into comics and check it out, because it's a cool little read, and I think it gives people a greater appreciation of who Mr. Freeze is. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Inside the Toy Room. If you did, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the little bell so you're notified every single time we upload a new episode here on Inside the Toy Room. As I mentioned, we're going to be uploading a villain special for the month of October for Halloween. So yeah, join us next week when we're going to take a look at probably the most sinister villain in comic book history, and that will be Carnage.